Okay, good evening. Good luck by the time you see this. We're now on the 16th out of 17 lectures altogether. Tonight's next to the last one. If you know what I'm talking about, shame on you. This is the winter series of 2020 to 2021. The name of our series is Roller Coaster, the State of Israel and the Jewish People in the mid-80s, mid-1980s. As I said, tonight is the 16th lecture out of a total of 17. The title of tonight's lecture is The Jewish Religion in the USA in the mid-80s, although I ended up focusing on one piece over here, because I make these titles, but by the time it comes down to brass tacks, my thoughts take over me, and they write what I write. But I do want to thank, as always, our series sponsor, Lehmann, for the Lehmann Lecture Series, and tonight's specific sponsor, who wanted to be anonymous, and so he said, this is being sponsored by somebody who lived through the 80s. I'll leave it at that. I'll honor the wish. We're grateful for our sponsors. For those who are interested in sponsoring a podcast, you can, and please do, contact me. I appreciate those that do. As we always say, if you, let me say this. Tonight is next to the last. Mirza Hashem, next week is the last lecture. That means after next week, you're going to be empty on Motzei Shabbos and Saturday nights. But if you wish to, go look at that YouTube site. And my son is always loading up a lot of old lectures from years ago. Chances are you didn't see it or you forgot it. If you actually remember them from long ago, there's something wrong with you. Okay, here we go. I do want to, as always, thank Yehuda Leib, who just got back from Florida, is really half asleep and throwing himself into making this work right now in terms of all the tech stuff. I want to thank Howard Elbam, as always, for putting together the PowerPoint, and, of course, Yossi Wedstein for doing his magic and producing a good final product. And now, without any further ado, I'll get down to the body of my remarks about religion in America, Jewish religion in America, in the 80s and before. A few weeks ago, I was speaking about Jewish culture in America. Tonight, I want to talk about Jewish religion. Culture being a secular thing, religion not. As we all know, Judaism in America, now I'm talking about Jewish religion, not Jewish culture, divided about 100 years ago into three parts: Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, roughly. I listed them in that order: Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, because in American history, Reform came first. I mean, I know the original Jews were Orthodox. Let's go to the first one here. I mean, this is from the colonial times. This guy was from Seixas, Mendes Seixas, Gershon Seixas, in what do you call it, the Spanish-Portuguese show in New York City. Let's go to the next video. This was an Orthodox from guy, a shochet, a chazan, and all that, and go on. And he was so much part of American life that, as you see over here, when George Washington, it's a dramatization, obviously, when George Washington was inaugurated in March, I guess, of 1789 on Wall Street, all the ministers of churches in New York City at that time, as small as it was, I guess Manhattan, delivered invocations, benedictions, including the Jewish rabbi, Jewish chazan, if you want to be technical. So the original Jews were from. But I got to temper that. These Orthodox communities were weak and disorganized. And when I say from, I'm talking about in terms of their former religious affiliation. I wouldn't say they were all Shomer Shabbos or kept things. Because of the Portuguese tradition, these were Portuguese, Spanish-Portuguese shuls. There were no rabbis. They only had chazanim, meaning a guy to literally chant the entire service on Shabbos and Yontif. And that meant that Judaism in colonial times in this country consisted exclusively of formal worship plus some laws and customs. So there's no such thing as a Mishnayos class, certainly a Daf Yomi, or anything remotely in that world, a class of any kind of engagement with Jewish texts, let alone Jewish ideas. That's not what it was. Jewish meant you kept kosher, hopefully you kept Taras Mishpacha, you kept Shabbat, you went to shul when services were held, which was on weekends, and dos y dos. You see? Now, it was the Reform trend, which came in the 1840s, which organized itself into an actual religious community. a religious denomination. Let's go to the next one. Here's Isaac Mayer Wise, who was the foremost leader in Reform Judaism in America. Now, he was an Amoritz. Even his own colleagues said it doesn't matter. He was a good speaker and an excellent organizer, and that's all it took. Okay? And he built the Reform movement into a movement with a national organization, so all the Reform shows belonged to a single organization. All the Reform rabbis belonged to a single organization. They actually held annual conventions. They passed resolutions and enforced them. Eventually, they centralized. Everybody had the same siddur. Everybody had the same Sunday school. In other words, from the Chetzonius point of view, they had it down great. It was actually organized. Okay? They had procedures for passing laws, the whole 9 yards. Now, this was an impressive achievement. As I say before, I don't care whether you're from or not, they certainly got the Chetzonius right, the externals. The problem from the Orthodox point of view was the content, the panemius. Okay? But the fact that all the synagogues and all the communities across the country who affiliated with Reform, which were many, the vast majority, followed the same line, the same rituals, the same resolutions, and the same form of worship, and all the rest of it, can be viewed as a very good thing. Now, what facilitated this process was the homogeneous nature of American Jewry at that time, particularly by the 1880s, which is when this stuff all took off. By the 1880s, 70s, and 80s, the German Jews had been here. They already had their early hard years. By now, they were already making department stores, successful businesses. They were prosperous, and now we're talking about their children, the second generation. Particularly second generation is where the Reform movement took off, because Vayakam Dor Chodesh ba'Amerika asher lo yada es shum davar miha yahadut hatoratit. Now, by contrast, the Orthodox at the time were not homogeneous. They were variegated in religious practice, heterogeneous, anemic in terms of numbers, and especially in terms of scholarship and in terms of the charisma, which is a word you're going to hear a lot tonight. In terms of the charisma, that in Orthodoxy can only come from high scholarship, and there was nobody like that. I'm speaking here of up to 1881. At the end of the day, you can do anything in America with money, but these guys couldn't command, no Orthodox cause could command money in the 1800s. The money was there, but nobody stepped forward who was able to raise that money for genuine and long-term causes. Now, in terms of heterogeneity, the Orthodox masses who start pouring into this country by zillions, starting in 1881, they became a flood of humanity. 2 million Jews poured in here from Eastern Europe. And these Jews, of course, settled all over the USA. And you say, well, then they should organize themselves. Well, guess what? Eastern European Jews are not all the same. To a German Jew, to an American guy, the Eastern Europeans are all the same. There's a big difference between the Polish. I'm not saying it should have been a difference. I'm saying this is what it was. The big difference between the Polish and the Litvische, the Hasidim, and the Nusach Sfarad, and Nusach Ashkenaz, and the Galicianers, and so on and such, and everybody set up all these little shuls, the Schnippishik shul, and if you're from Pripishik, you can't daven in the Schnippishik shul, and if you come from Klipishik, you can't say Kaddish in the Pripishik shul. They had all these Mishigats at that time, they really did. And so the idea of organizing themselves was just not even to be thought of. Any attempt to imitate the Reform and establish a national Orthodox framework proved to be impossible, because such a framework never existed in Europe. There were Eastern European Jews, they were all over Eastern Europe, but they didn't belong to one big organization. Now again, I'm not saying that's a good thing, it's actually a bad thing. Maybe a couple hundred years ago they had the Vada Arba Ratzot, but not by the time you get to the 1800s. So, actually, logically, such a framework was indeed a necessity for Orthodox Judaism or any kind of Judaism in a gigantic country like the USA, where everybody speaks the same language and you have these vast areas between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But again, it never existed back in Europe. A national framework required, and it can be done in America, it can be done, but it required a high degree of political experience and sophistication, and both were utterly lacking among the masses of Eastern European Jews who poured into America. I have in mind an organization with a national headquarters that could coordinate activities at the state and local level. In other words, a flexible national organization with strong and active local branches. It could work, but nobody thought in those terms. Let me put it this way. You could have had a term, it's a free country, you can do whatever you want. You could have had a Torah Masorah type organization in the 1880s, 1890s, certainly afterwards. You could have had a YU in those years without a problem, but it didn't happen. This kind of organization, which is logical, I think, to you and me, we're in the year 2021, was not within the ken of Orthodox rabbis and laymen at the time. It was beyond their frame of reference. They could have looked at the Catholics and simply imitated what the Catholics did, which is what they should have done. National organization, parochial schools, as they call them, eventually post-parochial schools, as you know, the Catholics have universities and things like that. Good ones, too. This was beyond the hasagas of the Rabbanim and the lay leaders, such as existed in those early years. Now, the main victim, of course, of the lack of organization was chinuch. No one, for whatever reason, could see the vital necessity of day schools at that time, or hardly anyone. There was one or two in the whole country. Now, you just have to understand, immigrants were pouring in. Public school actually worked at that time. Everybody liked it and went to public school. There was no discipline problems in those days. They actually learned stuff. And high school is free in America. And if you live in New York City, college is free. And even outside New York, college was cheap. And so that's the root. So even, I would say, the best of the modern Orthodox only thought in terms of public schools. Let's go to the next one. I'm thinking of Rabbi Dr. Bernard Drachman, who was a very interesting guy. But he I would say was the leading American-born, English-speaking Orthodox rabbi at that time, 100 years ago, 120 years ago. He's a Baal Tshuva, by the way. It's an interesting story. I just don't have time to go into it. And he had the Zichron Ephraim Shul in Manhattan and some other places as well. And he was a good writer, highly educated guy. He had a PhD from Germany. And what he called? He went to Columbia over here. He's an American-born guy. I remember he has all these articles. The ideal chinuch of the future, which consists basically of everybody going to public school, but have efficient Talmud Torahs. The only hope for the future. So that the kids, when they get a public school, will go to a Talmud Torah, which will be highly organized and well-run and well-funded, with a good curriculum, and that will be the salvation of American Jewry. Theoretically, it makes sense, but of course it never happened. Okay? His own school was a joke. Instead, the best they could think up, these Eastern European Jews, who are the overwhelming majority of the Orthodox Jews now settling in America, the best they could think up was a local Kehillah model, like they had in Europe, with a chief rabbi. And that, of course, as we see in the next one, was the famous episode of RJJ, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, who tried to be the chief rabbi of New York City. That fell down real quick. Now, although Rabbi Yaakov Yosef may have been a big rabbi back in Eastern Europe, he couldn't connect with the American Jews. Couldn't connect really with the youth. And the youth needed to be the priority. Now, people just didn't see it that way. That kind of thinking just didn't exist. There were so many shuls. I remember from my distant youth, and I've read more, a young person was given no time of the day. Wouldn't give him an aliyah, wouldn't give him any kind of kibbutz, if the kid wanted one. And, these people just didn't think about that. Okay? Now, where I'm going with all this is that in America, Orthodoxy would not succeed in organization. Reform succeeded in organization. If Orthodoxy would succeed in America, it could only be by charismatic leaders. And since we're talking about an Orthodox framework, there would have to be what we call Gedolim. People are perceived as being great, not just dynamic, great. The only way to inspire passion, and hindsight shows us, I would argue, that religion, particularly fundamentalistic religion, can only survive in America if it can inspire passion. This is true of the Christian fundamentalists, and it's certainly true of the Jewish fundamentalists, the Frum. Okay? To the degree that you have, passionate arousal, you get, people actively into the movement. Maybe too much, maybe not, but you get very strong emotional engagement. The regular denominations, which are not into passion, Jewish and Christian, are losing big numbers now. This is a well-known feature of modern American religious sociology. The conservative, the reform are in free fall, whatever they say. Same thing is true of the Episcopalians and the Methodists and the Presbyterian, the regular mainline churches. It's the charismatic fundamentalists. They're doing well, which is the main reason how Trump got elected. Correct? Now, as the 20th century proceeded, it will be clear that as far as Jews are concerned, a dividing line between what we call traditional Jews and Orthodox Jews, strongly Orthodox Jews. I'm not only talking about the ultra-Orthodox. This would be true, I say, of committed YU guys, that kind of thing. No question, T-net. A dividing line between the traditional Jews and the strongly Orthodox Jews would be this Gedolim passion thing I'm proposing tonight. Let me explain. If you look at the years 1900 to 1940, this was in America as far as Orthodox Judaism is concerned, the age of what I call traditional Judaism. These were grandparents, great-grandparents, if you hear that long. Yiddish-speaking rabbis. A lot of people in the community kept part of the mitzvahs, not part of the mitzvahs. There was a certain rabbinic charisma for some rabbanim, to an extent. This is what we call the era of the Agudas Rabbanim. I just did a podcast the other day, Rabbi Lazar Silver, people from that era. They were able, in their communities, to inspire a certain charisma, not a passion, but, people followed them to some degree. Now, by no means were they successful in keeping everybody Shomer Shabbos. That was hard in America in yesteryear. And you have plenty of people that are Orthodox, I call traditional. Plenty of people that are Orthodox, and the Orthodox show up, and they had the store open on Saturday, or similar sorts of things. That's how it went. This model of the Agudas Rabbanim, which was formed in 1902 to try to clean up traditionalism. At that time, you had a lot of phony Rabbanim running around, fakers, Amratzim, Deraisa, who were making a churban wherever they were. There was no way of telling who's a real rabbi, who's a real Talmid Chacham. And the Agudas Rabbanim was formed to set a standard. And they were successful in that limited degree. Okay? And I would tell you something interesting. In cities like New York and Chicago, this model didn't work well at all. In smaller communities, kind of worked better. If you think of the smaller communities, middle-sized communities, your New Havens, maybe your St. Louis, Kansas City, maybe Pittsburgh, places like that, Hartford, Connecticut, those kind of places. This model of one chief rabbi or something like that, did sort of work, okay? I repeat, sort of. But in the big cities where most of the Jews lived, they couldn't. These are the years when the OU was formed, in the late 1890s, because the Orthodox leaders at that time, especially the Americanized ones, said the Reform had one, so we need one too. But that's not enough of a way to make it a powerful organization. OU was a union of Orthodox congregations in America, very weak, okay? Because they couldn't provide passion. And they certainly couldn't be relevant for the younger American generation. This is what history shows us. I mean, you're trying to fix up kashrus. Let's look at the next one. Here's a famous book, Fraud, Corruption, and Holiness, A History of Kashrus in America. All these big rabbis and big names, turns out this one has a bad hechsher, and that one was bribed by the armored meatpacking company, and this one has this, and that one's that. If you're a young person in America, you say, the heck with all of this, okay? Now, the trick was, of course, to get the younger generation. But this Yiddish rabbi model that I'm talking about just didn't work. And since they had only one trick up the sleeve, they were in trouble. The only trick they had was, they didn't speak English, they weren't really Americanized, they can only have their own personality. If you're like Rabbi Lazar Silver, somebody so you have a personality that can connect. But that's rare. Usually they didn't. And so what they ended up doing, which is natural, was connecting with the older generation, which came from Europe like they did, and spoke Yiddish as they did. But as the older generation gets older and older and dies out, you have no constituency. That is the history of what went on at that time. Okay? This obviously opened the way for conservative Judaism. Basically, conservative Judaism cannibalized the younger element of the Orthodox quite successfully. As far as the younger people are concerned, at that time, the conservative movement represented a modern Orthodoxy. Look, halachic issues like the Mechitza and the Karbonis and the Bible criticism, that wasn't relevant. This is beyond the ken of the younger generation 100 years ago. They didn't care about those theological issues. They couldn't get worked up about these matters. They couldn't get affected by pronouncements like the Agudas Rabbanim. If you're old enough, you'll remember Every year, I go to our button, we'll put in the papers, don't go to conservative shul on Rosh Hashanah. Better stay home and don't hear the shofar. Yeah. Okay, I get it. Are you really do you think that that's really going to affect the vast masses of people that are attending conservative congregations? They're going to look at a paper for a pronouncement by Godes Rabbanan. So anyway, from 1900 to 1940, the conservative movement grew and grew at the expense of the American-born Orthodox. The Reform movement was static because the German Jews were the ones in the Reform movement, and they didn't really appeal at that time outside the German Jewish population. And what I call the YU Modern Orthodox, the Yeshiva, Yitzhak Elchanan, and Yeshiva College eventually, Modern Orthodox, slowly started to emerge, but it was very anemic. Okay? And here we have, of course, there's Dr. Rebel, and below there's Rebbe Lezer Silver, who always had this up and down relationship with YU. He wanted to be more of a yeshiva than a college. Dr. Rebel, by contrast, as you see up there, is giving the first honorary degree to Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein did him a favor by accepting, you understand? He really did. Albert Einstein did a lot of favors for Yeshiva University, which is a good thing. But what you're doing is you're holding up somebody who's not a Shomer Shabbos and possibly might be an Apikoros as your model. I understand why they do. I'm simply trying to show you the difficulty that modern Orthodox is going to have, which is you're too modern for the Orthodox, you're too Orthodox for the modern. Right? And hence the problems. And in this whole environment I'm describing, nobody generated passion. Nobody generated passion. Now this started changing in the mid-1940s. In the 1940s. Because, as we all know, charismatic rabbis immigrated here in the war and after the war and established a strong presence. Now, it was a minority presence. It appealed to a small number, but a strong minority. In other words, the people appealed to were strongly committed to it. They inspired a charisma such as not been seen before in America. If you take, for example, the Litvaks, as we go over here, you have, of course, Rabbi Cutler, and I'm speaking here in this capacity as being a charismatic and passionate presence. I'm sure a lot of American Jews can understand why, but those who inspired, oh my goodness, okay? For the Hasidim, right after the war, let's go here. You have the Satmar Rebbe. I mean, he was a ball of charisma. The Kloisenberg Rebbe also, of course, for their followers. But for their followers, they just weren't rabbis. They were like, whoa, you see? And obviously, of course, we go to the next one, Lubavitch. Here's the Friedrich Rebbe getting his citizenship paper. There's his successor, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. The Lubavitch photos everything, and in color too, right? And all kidding aside, the arrival in America of somebody like him, I mean, Lubavitch obviously like defines passion, right? It's got to be a game changer if he was over in Europe, now he's over here, okay? For the Lubavitch movement and everything that represents. Now, numerically, I repeat, these constituencies were small, but for the first time in America, you had passion, okay? You had people, whatever your particular leader is, that you feel very strongly about, and are willing to make life-changing decisions, which wasn't the case beforehand. Now, what Rabbi Aaron Cutler did was spark-plug the entire yeshiva movement. So there were schools and yeshivas that had already been started, but small and anemic. Near Israel and Baltimore comes to mind. Torah Das, Chaim Berlin was starting. So they small operations. And Aaron comes over here, is a spark plug, and the other Rosh Yeshivas became charismatic figures in ways that hadn't been before for increasingly large numbers of young people as the time went on. So let's go to the next one. This is when people like Rabbi Ruderman and Rav Hutner and Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rabbi Feinstein and others from Telz and wherever become, over the course of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, as I said before, something that they had not been beforehand, which is rock stars, charismatic figures that inspire passion among men and women who adhere to their particular group. Now, this is unprecedented in the United States of America. You just have to understand that. For those young people who are attracted to this phenomenon, the charisma consisted of these leaders being perceived as a connection to Eastern Europe, actually to Camelot, right? A frum utopia in Eastern Europe, which had been murdered cruelly by the Nazis, a land where every beggar and shoemaker was a Bakei B'Shas. This is how Europe seemed to be in the mind, the romantic imagination of the young American Jews. Indeed, the dramatic character of the Holocaust accentuated the extraordinary authenticity of the frum life that had once existed, hence the notion of the romanticism. Such lives of Judaic authenticity were precisely perceived as being sorely lacking in the decadent Orthodox Jewish life in the USA at that time. This is an Orthodox shul, nobody keeps anything. That's an Orthodox school, nobody practices anything. The quest to restore that Camelot, or to some extent, was a grand quest that gave meaning and nobility into life, one that transcended the American materialist ideal, if you're part of the group that I'm talking about that was attracted to this. To provide a grand sweep, and again, nothing like this had ever existed in the USA. Okay? Now, I'm emphasizing a romanticist charisma. You look at the past as being ideal, and you want to recreate as much as possible over here. Mutatis mutandis, even realizing it's America. Okay? Now, the key combination here was charisma with youth. This was due, in other words, what hadn't been beforehand, the rabbis connecting with the young, was here. This was due, obviously, to the emphasis on educational institutions. A yeshiva, by definition, means a youthful population. And so for this first time, you have Eastern European rabbis having a personal and strong personal connection with young American Jews, male and female. Okay? And young people means they're going to be here tomorrow, and they're going to be the day after, and they're going to have the children, and they represent the future. As a result of these factors of authenticity, spirituality, passion, a grand goal, an entire subculture formed over the next 4 decades, as many of you and I know firsthand. The numbers were tiny at first, but the fact that they were a young population meant that there would be a future. Central to all this was the personal, passionate attachment to the cause that these Roshei Yeshiva personified. This was countercultural in terms of American youth in general, and American Jewish youth in particular, who are pretty darn materialistic. And by that I mean you're interested in growing up, going to college, getting a job, and making a living, and hopefully becoming prosperous. In the case of Rabbi Cutler, his students would go through fire and water for him, if you know who he was. He could inspire that. I'm talking about American students. As a natural leader, Rabbi instinctively, I believe, developed a unique brand, as we would say today, in the best model of corporate America. In other words, it's not only about Lehmann Torah. Of course, the yeshiva is all about Lehmann Torah, and Lehmann Torah is always the supreme value. Okay, but under Rabbi Cutler, it's a lot more than that. It included a principled rejection of college, already starting in the 40s. Lakewood and other yeshivas, no college, on purpose. Okay? Near Israel was always in hot water as a result of that. That's quite a cultural statement. And by the way, that means the principled rejection of YU. Number 2, what I call Hirschianism. The ban on the Synagogue Council in 1956 under the leadership of Rabbi Cutler, as many will possibly recall, got all the big Rosh Yeshivas together, and they issued like a cherem and isser. You can't join any organization which includes conservative and reform rabbis, because it's like giving them recognition that they're legitimate and they have no legitimacy whatsoever. Okay? And so if we go to the next one, that's basically Ron Cutler's Samson Raphael Hirsch. Now, not exactly, but you get the idea. If you don't understand what I just said, then imagine there's such a thing in Baltimore called the Baltimore Board of Rabbis. That is Orthodox, considered rabbi, all the rest of it. You have something else called the Vada Rabbanim. Most of the people in the Vada Rabbanim will, on purpose, not be members of the Baltimore Board of Rabbis, because they didn't regard it as a legitimate council, because it represents non-Orthodox Judaism, and to them, it's just not Judaism. You see? And now, by the way, many people disagree with that. The OU didn't, the YU didn't, Rabbi Salvation, but Rabbi put it out there. That became the yeshivish approach, and it's remained that till today. This is what I mean by a brand. Kollel. Rabbi started the Kollel. This is absolutely revolutionary. You never had that in America. that, wait a minute, you were learning until you got married. No. You're learning after you get married. How are you learning after you get married? I don't know. It's Rabban, up to Rabban, 30, 40, whatever. I mean, this is just shattering all the American career pattern, normal ideas of how to, plot your life. Okay? If it's Rabban, it's the Agudas Yisrael, not Mizrahi. Nothing Zionist. Only Agudas, True Blue, Haredi, and everything, right wing. That's the only legitimate kind of frumkeit. Anything other than that, if you're Mizrahi, like that. If it's Rabban, the central and supreme institution in Jewish life by far is the yeshiva, not the synagogue. The old model, the Agudas Rabbanim, the shul, is the main institution of Jewish life. No, it's not. The synagogues have proved themselves to be decadent. They're run by Balabatim that don't keep anything, have no understanding of Torah, no respect for Torah. They're putting in Philistine values. And so the synagogue is basically rejected. And the only real place where Judaism is practiced properly is the yeshiva. The corollary of this is that the yeshiva student, the Ben Torah as they call him, is the highest form of life, literally, in the world. There's human beings and there's Ben Torah. Let's see on the next one. Like the Gemara said, Man Malchi Rabbana, who are the kings, the Rabbana of the kings, meaning the yeshiva student, literally. Now, if you inspire your youth with this, and if they buy into this, then a kid like this, I'm learning yeshiva, heck with college, and I am doing not only the Ratzon Hashem, I'm a member of a super elite. I'm a member higher group than any other group in the world. Maybe the outside world's too stupid to understand that, but I understand it. We understand it. Okay? And so I repeat, this is the highest form of life. Not what had been in America and Germany elsewhere. You know who used to be the highest form of life? An MD who wins the Nobel Prize and is a Shabbat Shabbos, especially if he goes to a shir. Oh my goodness. He's an award-winning professional, and yet he's 100% observant. That's the role model. No, not Rabban. That's a bidyev. That's second. Heck with the Nobel Prize, right? The boy is learning yeshiva and koah. That is the model. That's the highest form that there is. Everything else is second best. Third best, fourth best. Now, this is nothing but a reflection of the classic Lithuanian yeshiva deliberate cultivation of a sense of elitism among its students, feeling of superiority. That is what the Litvish yeshivas did. That is one of the main tools in creating a constituency and inoculating their youth against all the messages from society which said you're a bunch of losers. He flipped it and said, no, we're not the losers, you're the losers. Elitism, of course, breeds all kind of feelings of superiority, which can be a little bit difficult to tolerate. It's interesting in Jewish history. Let's go to the next one. The Baal Shem Tov, but the original Hasidism was opposed to this. Baal Shem Tov said any learning that's bred with a sense of gaiva, elitism, is bad. It's pogrom. It was held against him for saying that. But he strongly criticized this notion. But in the long run, let's go to the next one. The Hasidic movement changed. And, if in Chabad, what's the highest form of life in the world? There's human beings and then there's Chabad, really. And other Hasidic groups have the similar theologies. I repeat, theologies. This is what happens. Now, by the way, the outside world does it also. If you go to prep school, go to Boys Latin, go to Gilman, what are you taught with breakfast, lunch, and supper? Go to Harvard and Yale, Ivy League school. What are you taught with breakfast, lunch, and supper? You're the elite, right? You're the foremost. Now, did I tell you this story? Back in 2016, when Trump won, I was teaching in college, in Hopkins, and everybody was in a shock. And I came into class, they said, we can't have class today. What happened yesterday defies belief. And we got to talk about it. Okay, talk about it. Professor, how could it be that, the public voted for Trump? So I said, obviously he was able to channel the resentment that many of the masses out there, especially in middle America, have towards guys like you who are in Ivy League schools and are always going to feel themselves superior and they're going to run the country. And Trump was able to channel this and from resentment turned into being elected president. And I remember a student said to me, what does that mean, Professor? I mean, look, Didn't John Adams teach us the masses are asses? Yeah. So this elitism is not just Lakewood. It's not just near Israel. Everybody does that. Okay, now we'll get back to that later. In this world, this universe I'm talking about, the Rosh Yeshiva is the highest authority. Certainly not a synagogue rabbi. It's almost held against you. When I was a little kid, nobody in Yeshiva wanted to be a rabbi of a shul. That was considered because the shuls were no good, as they were perceived. They're all sellouts, place of compromise. True Judaism is not acceptable there by the Balabatim. Therefore, just become a Balabas or a chinuch or something like that, and stay a true Ben Torah. These ideas are all Rabbi Cutler ideas, right? And finally, Rabbi gathered all the other yeshiva heads into something called the Post-Gedolim, the Council of Torah Sages for the Agudah. And this group became, under his dynamic leadership, the authoritative body in American Jewry, the only authentic one, for that slice of American Jewry. To institutionalize it even. Now, he succeeded. This is quite a story I'm telling you today of one man's achievements in a free American liberal society. The best example of this theme of authenticity charisma that I'm harping on tonight at length and how it caught on are the remarks, the famous remarks now, by the head of YU, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik. Although obviously he did not agree with all the opinions and rulings of Rabbi Cutler, I mean, he was the head of Yeshiva University, but it's very famous that in 1956, the Chinuch Hatzmai dinner, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik states that he regards Rabbi Cutler as the personification of Orthodox Jewish authenticity. Here's a famous recording it's in Yiddish, because it's the Rav, he spoke Yiddish those days. But it's got English translation on it. Look at this.
Kein Schemetz von Politik und kein Schemetz von Briefe und kein Schemetz von Komplimenten. Ich habe mir klar, der Mensch zu geben Komplimenten. Reingezogen in der Arbeit speziell mir oder Rosh Yeshiva Rav Cutler, aber lass mir wegwerfen den modernen Namen Rav Cutler, lass mich ihm rufen Rebbe. Etwas, da kenne ich in ihm, wie Jesef oder konnte Juden, mich als jener ist geworden aufgeregt und hat gesagt, mit Beis Abo. Gehört zu der Beis Abo. Etwas in ihm redt, wie ich stelle mich vor, hat einmal gerett, Rebbe Berbrisker, mein alter Seele. Etwas in ihm redt, wie ich stelle mich vor, hat einmal gerett, Chassam Sefer mit Rabbi Cutler. Aufregung ist beides Zorn und Verlangen für jene Machreies. Wie Helim ist Chalim, Leuram, Schaltal mit Chachamim. Genießen von sehr Licht noch wenig. Kalte Teire, wie kalte Licht ist gar nicht. Es darf sein heiße Licht. Aber das auch abbringen, wenn wir kommt nun zuzuhören. Ungeborgen, der größere Rosh Yeshiva, Gott nicht kalte Licht als der. Es ist heiß, es brennt. Und am kommt zu ihm, nun wird man alle warm. Und ob sie da einer, was hat mir Marren gemacht, Vater Chinuch ist das der alte Rosh Yeshiva Rabbi Cutler, von wem ich will gebeten im ganzen Leben sich aufstellen und ihm bedanken.
That's just a remarkable cultural moment, okay? I repeat, so the head of YU is saying that the personification of Orthodox Jewish authenticity is the Rosh Yeshiva Lakewood, right? A little bit later, that wouldn't have happened. Now, together, these elements that I've laid out for you tonight constitute a brand which was both distinct and passionate. You're joining a team. In fact, you're joining the Knights of the Round Table. And controversially, this brand proved so powerful that it dragged modern Orthodoxy to the right, or at least endeavored to, which is an interesting story because starting after the Second World War, the outstanding graduates of modern Orthodoxy, like Rabbi Norman Lehmann and others, and Rackman at the side, Rabbi Emanuel Lackman, they had plans and visions of how Orthodox Judaism was going to evolve in the USA under their leadership the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, it didn't turn out that way at all. In other words, this model did not become the dominant model among Orthodox Jews in America. So Rabbi Cutler, or perhaps a milder form of that, that became, for most people in most communities, the model of the proper direction in which to go. Now, they didn't like it, and Rabbi Lehmann and others were always criticizing it, but it doesn't matter. This is the way it went. So what I'm talking about is the development of such a powerful and passionate movement that it exercised pressure, perhaps magnetism even, on wider groups outside their own narrow constituency, which is interesting. Look at the title of that book. Yitz Greenberg, Modern Orthodoxy, The Road Not Taken. The Road Not Taken. Now, Rabbi died, of course, beginning in the 1960s. So that means in 20 years, he came here in 41. In 21 years, he created a distinct American yeshiva world. I repeat, this was brand new in the history of the USA. It's a yeshiva world. It's a group. Ner Rizzo, for example, would be on the extreme left of that world because they had college, but it's still part of that world. By contrast, YU was not part of that world and was made to feel pretty doggone uncomfortable as a result of that. But that means Rabbi was not here for the 60s. One can only imagine what Rabbi Cutler would have done with the 60s. Or are you too old to remember the 60s? Although unimaginable in the bourgeois America of the 40s and 50s, the 60s and 70s, as we know, would witness the years of the hippie, rock and roll, the Vietnam protests, the campus riots, and the general youth rebellion against the bourgeois values of middle-class America. In other words, an entire counterculture. I mean, what do you call Haight-Ashbury of yesteryear? And all these sit-ins, the pictures speak for themselves. It was just an attack by disaffected youth on the values of America. And it was pretty doggone powerful. I remember when I was a kid, and so do you possibly, staid, middle class, lawyers and doctors, walking around with these stupid Nehru jackets, you remember that? And the long sideburns. I mean, it hit everybody. So if you were 70 years old, you want to look like you were 20. It's a very interesting period. I cannot forbear, whenever we evoke the image of the Woodstock era, to share the famous characterization by John McCain back in the year 2008.
In case you missed it, a few days ago, Senator Clinton tried to spend $1 million on the Woodstock Concert Museum. Now, my friends, I wasn't there. I'm sure it was a cultural and pharmaceutical event. I was tied up at the time, but the fact is,
I take it you understand what it meant. He was a prisoner in Hanoi, wasn't he? Shot down in the Air Force. Now, my point, though, is this countercultural revolution actually facilitated the appeal of a frum or yeshivish counterculture, because now there are many of them. So going the Orthodox route and growing this type of beard, as opposed to that kind of beard, they're just one of many. Indeed, the yeshivas and the girls' analogs of the yeshivas became institutions of socialization into counterculturalism. The most blatant example of this counterculture was rejection of college and the adoption of the kollel lifestyle. This idea of the wife working and not the husband went against everything in bourgeois American culture, as we know. And let me tell you something. It wasn't common in Europe either. It was rare in Eastern Europe as well. It existed. I mean, the Chavetz Chaim, for a period in his life, he was learning his wife ran the store. Same thing with the Aruch HaShulchan. There's a famous story of the Aruch HaShulchan. His wife ran the store. He officially was supposed to be in the store, but he was learning all day long. Neither of these two were wasting their time. And they told the Aruch HaShulchan, when he was a young man, of course, the government inspector's coming, and you're officially the guy who owns the store, so you have to be there when the Russian inspector shows up. And he's wandering down the main street of that town in which he lived, and people say, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for my store." You understand? But that wasn't common, okay? And by the way, the reason they became rabbis later on is because the store failed. It wasn't a good business model. Although, to be perfectly honest, we do have in Jewish history, medieval Ashkenaz, a historical precedent for the wife running the business and the husband learning of the husband not running the business. I gave a whole talk about this when I was in Vienna in 2019. Does anybody remember the period before the corona? I'm too old. Too long ago. About this period, and I think I've spoken about on other occasions, that wonderful article from Israel Epstein. But we'd have to go back to medieval Ashkenaz for this model, not in America. Now, in the 2 decades after the death of Rabbi Cutler, he died in 1962, he left no successor with his type of dynamic personality. Nevertheless, the authenticity, charisma of his colleagues remained as an anchor for this subculture. Right? He had bestowed all the Rosh Yeshivas. Now, not he had bestowed, he inspired. All this kind of aura, right? This kind of aura, this charisma, this passion thing, this authenticity thing. After the death of Rabbi Cutler, as the next video shows us, his successor, there's Rabbi Feinstein. There's the Baron and Moshe at a wedding. Isn't that a great little video? Right? And so Rabbi Cutler died. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein became perceived as, you can call this the video of the passing of the torch. Now, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein had a different persona. His personal character was different. And his role, he was a posek. I know he's a Rosh Yeshiva, they had MTJ and all the rest of it. That's not really his, outstanding perceived quality. It was as a posek. A halachic decisor. Okay? We all know that. Now, but Rabbi Moshe Feinstein certainly possessed the same authenticity, charisma, and the ability to inspire passion, which in his case meant that his rulings, his halachic rulings, were followed, and the other opinions were pretty much ignored. So, in that era, don't we all remember the Igros Moshe with the Bible? And if this rabbi said a microphone is okay, and Moshe Feinstein said it's not okay, it's not okay. If he said this mechitza is okay and the other one is not okay, it's okay. You see? He was the final authority, which is pretty remarkable in America. Now, by the way, unlike all these others, Moshe Feinstein published his scholarship. When you publish it, it means you expose it to peer review, okay? Which is interesting, and criticism. And boy, was he criticized. There's a wonderful sefer I have here. Everybody should get it, called Psichos Egros. And it contains, a guy did a nice job. He got all the scholarly criticism, the other rabbis. Great scholars. And their specific, substantive critiques of his different responsa. There's nothing wrong with that in the world, right? Peer review is fine. People like Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and, like that. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever in the world. But it fills a fat volume. That means that he wasn't afraid to put out his opinions and take it, whether people like it or not. And anybody who knows anything about Rabbi Moshe knows some of his rulings were very controversial, like the one about the artificial insemination, Hasra Malachutit. The Satmar went crazy. The Hasidim, they wanted to firebomb his house and all kind of, oh my goodness. I could stand here a long time and tell you a bunch of stories. They didn't care. That's who he was, right? And more importantly, all the criticism in the world didn't mean jack, because that is the meaning of authority. The public side gets, I don't care what anybody says. You got this right, you got this wrong. He's the man. He had that charisma. Because, my friends, at the end of the day, the halachic system, it's not a halachic system. It's at the end of the day, whether you like it or not, it's based on the kishka feelings of the charismatic posek, when you have a charismatic posek, and that's the meaning of the much overused term Das Torah, right? Not everybody is a Das Torah, and the Mishpacha magazine and the other newspapers don't have a Das Torah, whatever they say. Sounds like a Rosh Hashanah Das Torah. Doesn't come across too often. And by that I mean, you could read the sources and come up with a different reading. It's not a halachic system. The way he put it together, the way he saw it, that became the psak. And that's the way it's been run in Klal Yisrael for many centuries. Okay? At the end, in other words, I'm telling you, the halachic system is a mystical, non-academic phenomenon, which goes back to the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, go to the judges and officers at that time, rabbis if you wish. Inquire of them, they'll give you the verdict. And act according to the decisions they give you. Be careful to do what they instruct you to do, the Torah says, this in the Chumash. Al pi ha-Torah asher yarucha, what they tell you to do, you do. Lo sasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'shmol. Don't go to the right or to the left. Which means, don't go and say, I'm more to the right of them, I'm firmer than them, therefore I don't follow it, or I'm to the left of them. You go by the do. It's always interesting to me, Moshe Feinstein is the only responsa writer that I know of in America, other than, I know the couple Hasidic ones, but I mean the classic sense of Shalach and Shuvah's writers, I think down till today. We don't have a culture of people published this kind of responsa. In Israel you do, but not in America. At least not that I can think of, which I find very interesting. And certainly none everywhere approached the traction of his works. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is the fact that he and his colleagues lived long enough to serve as living role models into the 1960s, 70s, and even the 80s. So the live charisma, he was there, lasted for a long time, and the living charisma of authenticity lasted that much longer. Now, I have tonight, for reasons of time, spent my time in the so-called black hat yeshiva world. But similar phenomena in these decades happen in the Hasidic world, right? After all, you don't need me to tell you, the Lubavitcher Rebbe certainly had a powerful version of authenticity charisma, right? And followers that go through fire and water for him. And not only there, you see what I'm saying? No, the Rebbe wasn't simply a Rebbe, but he possessed a charismatic and passion-inspiring personality. Same thing is true. Oh yeah, and with the Lubavitch, you also have the outreach. I mean, to go into that world. Does anybody know what that is on the upper left-hand corner? If you're my age, of course you do. Jeff, are you out there? That's the Lubavitcher Rebbe with Bobby Kennedy, right? And Menachem Begin and Reagan and so forth. So, Lubavitch really took it out there, as we know. But the Satmar certainly, let's put it this way, the Satmarov, the old title bound, you can agree with his position on this or not, and his followers and even beyond, but his followers, oh my goodness, he's the definition of, he was a living fire, like the human torch of passion and charisma. That's who the Satmarov was. Of course, though, nobody lives forever. And so in the 80s, everybody died. To be more exact, the Satmarov died in the late 70s, and Lubavitcher Rebbe lasted until the early 90s. They already had strokes and things like that. And Rabbi Soloveitchik already started to have the Alzheimer's late 80s. You know, they kind of left the scene in one way or another in the time we're talking about in the 80s for the most part, not all of them. And then the question becomes, is there life after Gedolim? Are there authenticity, charisma-bearing, passion-inspiring individuals who succeed them? By definition, the successors of all these people born in America could not possess the same charisma, and they could not claim the same authenticity. Furthermore, they could not claim the same level of scholarship. Yeshivas of Lakewood today, the first one to tell you they ain't no Rabbi Cutlers, don't claim to be. Same thing in all the other yeshivas, right? And that's a tricky thing, by the way, scholarship in the frum world. It's got to be perceived. I'm not speaking here of simply academic scholarship, knowing Shas and that sort of thing, but insight and Das Torah, which these other people, the ones I've been speaking about tonight, were perceived as possessing. Their successors would be the first ones to acknowledge their inferiority. Ask the successors, obviously in Chabad, the Hornady. Ask the successors by Satmar, in relation to Rabbi Yoel. Ask the successors in all the yeshivas in there, Israel, and Chaim Berlin, and Torah Das, and MTJ, and so on and so forth. Lakewood, they'll all say this, you know, we are who we are. We don't claim to be in the same universe as the other. In other words, you and I, if you're old enough, we lived through something like the break between the Tanaim and Amoraim, or between the Rishonim and Achronim. It's very interesting. A certain generation died out, and just with a certain a feeling, perception, that the ones coming afterwards are great people, but not like it was before. Right? What was it like when the last Tana died and the Amoraim came along? I mean, life went on, but it's perceived that is the last of the old generation. They possess something that the next ones don't possess. So the Amoraim is not going to argue with a Tana. And same thing in the perception of what we generally call the Rishonim Achronim. There came a certain point where it came to be seen, well, we have big people today, but we ain't got no Rajbas running around. You see, we ain't got no Rabbeinu Towns running around. So it's just interesting, because this is something that people feel instinctively, intuitively, cannot be defined, but it's very real. Now, after the passing, in others, of these possessors of unique charisma, which happened in the 80s, the question becomes, what will become of frum life in the absence of living personalities who could inspire this kind of passion? The Orthodox world, which by that time had grown, would have to do something about this charisma deficit or lack. This is not unique in Jewish history, but is interesting in the context of the late 20th century American Judaism. Now, one part of the answer has been institutions. The men have died, but the institutions are still here. All the leaders mentioned tonight left behind institutions that continue to influence youth, not only youth. So the Hasidic groups still have their youth and their whole yeshivas and their school systems and all the rest of it. The yeshivas are still there. The students and successors still look to the previous one as their role models, as it were. Going to any day school and a lot of these pictures of these people I'm talking about on the walls. So wherever you go, and by the way, it's true in YU also. And nobody claims today days like Rabbi Soloveitchik. Nevertheless, the institution is there. You see? Now, in the case of YU, the passing of figures like Rabbi Soloveitchik or David Lipschitz, right, also famous, enabled, as we've seen in our lifetime, the rise of open Orthodoxy, because they went there to restrain the secessionists to the left, shall I call it, which I think would have been the case. Most people would agree had they still remained. But in general, I would say that the passing of these charismatic figures led to them being succeeded by translations of texts and other tools that enabled closer engagement, indeed direct engagement, with the classical texts of Torah. It's kind of interesting. Sir Moshe Feinstein is not around, but on the other hand, the average Balabas can learn and understand Shas, if he wants to, thanks to the Art Scroll. And he can access an amazing array of sources and analyses of sources on any halachic questions, increasingly in English too. I mean, for goodness sake, now you can read the Yerushalmi. Nobody in history, with very few exceptions, could penetrate the Yerushalmi. Now it's got Art Scroll. Anybody can do it. I can't, and other translations. The other ones are good one too. It's decent revolutionary in terms of the ability to access previously unpenetrable texts, to increase the level of knowledge among the average mass of people, or among certain of them, and this got to be a game changer. Okay, the full effects of which we're living with hasn't played itself out yet. So in other words, the physical charismatic Gadol was replaced by the user-friendly text. At least that's how I see it. And this is a process that's going to continue. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but sooner or later you're going to get the Art Scroll Noda B'Yehuda and the Art Scroll Minchas Chinuch and so on and so forth. And if somebody's willing to, male or female, by the way, you can master the Minchas Chinuch. You see? Or the Ketzos. Now, it's inevitable, everything I just said. It's part of the Americanization process that occurred to this subculture in the late 20th century. But this subculture refracted it in its own way. In the case of Art Scroll, it's the Manhattan Project. Produce a giant A-bomb, right? They took classic American organization of large workforce on a big centrally directed project. And as we know, they turned out the Babling Rishalmi. In other words, they're making classic texts available in an unprecedentedly efficient manner on a mass scale. What do you call that? I call that American. That's what this country's famous for, right? In the case of Chabad, they got the franchise model, correct? Which is a classic case. You send the shliach here, you're on your own, you have connection with the central headquarters, but on the other hand, you run your own operation. That's your Kentucky Fried Chicken. That's American. And it works, right? So here's an Eastern European Hasidic group which adapted and refracted for its own uses the classic American models, right? Then there's the use of the internet, which is a game changer again because it provides you unbelievable access to all kind of things that were beyond your reach once upon a time. So it's interesting because on the one hand, these Gedolim died and left the scene in the 80s just before the age of the internet. And the age of the internet, as every parent knows, every adult, has posed unprecedented challenges. Not the type of challenges that these rabbis faced in the 20th century. Because nowadays, as we all know, thanks to the technological revolution, kids, anyone, can see anything, and look, I mean anything, at the touch of a smartphone. And we all know that they do, whether you like it or not. Now here's a challenge, talking about the internet, the smartphone, and all this stuff, that really requires what we call Das Torah. You need Das Torah of the old school, combined with a full awareness of American social reality. I mean, what to do? You can't tell everybody not to have a computer. You can't tell everybody not to have a phone. Not in America. That's not a mass solution. Okay? So my point is that such a thing requires wisdom. And as the Bible teaches us, where are you going to find wisdom? It's not easy. What would, now this is a question without an answer, what would people of that wisdom, but with their feet on the ground in American reality, have advised in the age of the internet? Isn't that a great question? In the years since their death, I wouldn't say that there have been ideological challenges to Orthodox Judaism, but to be perfectly honest, this is changing. I don't want to go into this. Those who know what I'm talking about will know what I'm talking about. But there certainly has been the challenge of consumerism, which was not there in the 20th century in the same way. Now, 20th century consumerism, 21st century, look at the ads in Mishpacha, the ads in the Ami. But consumerism is a big subject, and I will leave that for next year because the hour is late. But I do want to end with what I regard as a fascinating observation, a feature of the Corona era, in which you and I find ourselves. As I mentioned before, all these groups cultivated an elitism. Elitism breeds feelings of superiority. Ordinarily, it's harmless. It's just obnoxious. That's harmless. Okay? But in the Corona era, it hasn't been so harmless. It has led to a widespread, as we all know, flaunting of the rules, even to the point of civil disobedience. This is a funeral that took place this past week in Yerushalayim. You know this. Forget all the masks and the Corona stuff. Okay? Can you show it? Yeah. You can turn off the sound. The sound doesn't matter. Right? But what we see of it, I mean, I know you saw this. Okay? Now, what does that mean? You don't give a darn? The rules don't apply to us? What about public health and safety, all the rest of it? The rules apply to other people. They do not apply to us. That's kind of interesting. This has pitted this culture against the civil authorities in both Israel and America, as we all know, and elsewhere. But you want to know something? Let's discuss this next year. Hopefully, the Corona era will be over by then, and we'll all have a good time rejoicing over that fact. So with that, I bid you a good night.